Good morning, America, and good afternoon to those where they have afternoon. My name is Omar Mohammed, and I am a senior fellow at the program on extremism at George Washington University. Our guest speaker today is a seasoned diplomat from the UK's Foreign Office. He has served as a diplomat in many countries, including in Iraqi Kurdistan in Erbil. He's also the head of Counter-Daesh Communication Cell, which works, in fact, on behalf of the coalition. Martin War, welcome.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Omar. Good morning, Washington and Paris and everywhere else on the line. Very good to be with you, and thank you for inviting me to speak. And I do apologize for my last hopeless effort to connect with you a couple of weeks ago. I'm sorry about that. Let me begin, if I may, by just explaining who I am, so you can position. You can turn off now, or stay online if that's all right. So I am, as Omar mentioned, I'm a career diplomat. Spent most of my time in the Middle East, handling conflict and counterterrorism. It seems that those issues come together quite a lot. Most recently, as Omar has mentioned, I was in northern Iraq to witness the liberation of Mosul and other territories and the territorial defeat of Daesh itself. I'm now the head of what is known as the Counter-Daesh Communication Cell, which is based in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office here in London. We work on behalf of the coalition, running most of their communications, mostly their strategic communications. Now, the cell was set up in 2015 by the British Prime Minister, David Cameron, now our Foreign Secretary, rather strangely. He set us up to run the coalition's communications, as I've mentioned. Not in terms of issuing press releases and communiques about meetings, which is what most communications organizations do, but to very specifically undercut Daesh's propaganda to radicalize, recruit, inspire, and instruct its followers to commit acts of terrorism. We've been doing that now for nearly 10 years as part of the broader counter-Daesh mission of the global coalition. Today, I'm going to talk briefly about the successes of the coalition, about the challenges it faces as the coalition marks its 10th anniversary, and how it might meet those challenges. And then I'd be very, very happy to take questions. That's usually sometimes the more informative and fun bit of these events. I should emphasize at the outset that I'm speaking in more a personal than official capacity. So please don't take what I say as coalition or British policy. It's kind of how I see things. I like to debate things. So first, what do I think the coalition has achieved in the last 10 years? My own view is that it's quite a lot, and I don't say that just because I'm kind of a member of it. I think one can justify that claim. Most dramatically, it stopped Daesh driving into Baghdad and Erbil a few years ago. I can assure you Erbil would have been empty by the time that they got there. If they had got there, people were already beginning to take to the mountains once again. I don't know what Daesh would have done if they'd got to Baghdad. Baghdad has a habit of consuming those who occupy it. And I think one of the reasons, frankly, that Daesh failed in Iraq and Syria at the time was, ironically, the speed of its success. I think it actually rather overreached itself. But it would have been a very, very shocking moment for one of the most iconic capitals of the Middle East to have fallen to a medieval force in pickups, which is often how Daesh entered places. Within 5 years, coalition has regained all of the huge swathes of territory occupied by Daesh in Iraq and Syria. It's undone the caliphate physically, perhaps not mentally, we'll come back to that. And it's helped to reduce Daesh, I think, from an occupying force to bare operational bones. I'm sure we'll come back to that point too. Along the way, the coalition has absolutely liberated millions of Iraqis and Syrians from barbarism, I think, so that they can rebuild their lives. And I think the coalition has been a really very important catalyst for billions of dollars worth of international humanitarian and reconstruction assistance, so that physical reconstruction can take place. In Iraq, the conversation now, as I sense it, is no longer so much about Daesh and whether it presents a sort of existential threat to the state of Iraq. Number of Daesh attacks and the volume of Daesh propaganda worldwide, certainly in Iraq and Syria, has fallen radically since 2017. It's still happening, but it's a very different series of bar charts when you look at the numbers. Daesh's finances are at their weakest, and from the prisons and camps in northeast Syria, the coalition and its partners have repatriated thousands of men, women, and children. Population of Al-Hol, for example, is now 42,000, much reduced from the 70,000 of a few years ago. And this, I think, is a story that is a bit of a success and hasn't really been told. So I'm keen that that word gets out there. I think a lot of credit needs to go to the government of Iraq in particular for helping to reduce the Iraqi numbers in Al-Hol camp by 24% alone in 2023. And 2022 was a good percentage as well. A smaller population in those camps means less bad conditions, less radicalization, less long-term threat from those environments. I would say too that Daesh has failed repeatedly as a result of direct coalition and coalition partner activity to keep its leaders alive. Maintaining its numbers in the core and breaking out people from those prisons and camps in northeast Syria. Again, I think some of that kinetic success by the coalition over the last few years, including since 2019, has been slightly overlooked and taken for granted. Leaders of Daesh can no longer assume that they are safe. They are subject to very direct attack and being killed, and that is a positive consequence of the countering of Daesh by the coalition. In short, I think the coalition can rightly claim to be one of the most successful international organizations in many, many years, given that list of achievements. And I sometimes compare it, in my mind at least, to that extraordinarily successful and coherent coalition that came together to liberate Kuwait after Saddam's invasion. Now, that's many years ago, but that was a benchmark, I think, for how the international community can respond politically and then operationally to address a particular problem. I think the coalition is on a par. Coalition against Daesh is on a par with the episodes of that time. Now, the coalition itself has not done all of this itself alone. On the ground, again, not always understood, it was Iraqis and Syrians who defeated Daesh and lost many soldiers and many, many civilians in the process. They sacrificed a great deal. And again, I think it's fair to say that point is not always fully understood. I think it's also fair to say that without the coalition, that success might not have happened. Those indigenous forces might not have had the confidence. Confidence is a key word here. Daesh, I think, were extremely good at undermining confidence and terrorizing, as indeed they seek to do. But building that confidence back up, as well as a capability, I think has been a fundamental achievement of the coalition in supporting local forces. And I think also in answering the question, what has the coalition achieved, it's worth asking what the Middle East might look like today if the coalition had not been formed. It's not inevitable that Iraq alone would have been able to wrestle back its country any more than it proved inevitable that Iraqi forces were able to stop Daesh in their tracks in the first place. That, I think, was a terrible shock to see in 2000 and ever. So I think we shouldn't assume that what we have today would have happened if the coalition had not been formed. So are we looking at the situation in which the whole of Syria and Iraq might now be an established and functioning Islamic state, the caliphate extending for on a decade? I don't think we should discount that possibility. Consequences of that are pretty shocking to contemplate, whether you're talking about the consequences in other Muslim states in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, or as it were, non-Muslim states in the West. It's a pretty frightening thought, I think, about what might have been, and is not entirely inconceivable a thought. I think we can assume that there would have been many, many more terror attacks and deaths worldwide if that had not come about, if the coalition had not mustered in the way it has. And if the coalition had not formed in 2014, would it be formed now to face that threat, face down the renewed threat from Islamist extremism and terrorists? I actually think not. We're now living in a very different and more contested and fragmented world in which transnational threats are growing, but transnational responses seem harder and harder to mount. Witness what is happening both in Europe and in the Middle East at the moment. In simple terms, a competition for the necessary attention, we call it bandwidth now, the attention and resource that's needed to face down something like Daesh, much, much greater than it was 10 years ago. And of course, I'm referring to economic consequences of COVID, which has decimated governments' coffers, ministries of finances, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the 7th of October, and the aftermath of that terrible day. So I think the coalition has a lot to be proud of. It's a slightly unusual, unique, essentially voluntary coalition from a particular moment in time, particularly horrific moment in time. But I'm afraid to say a lot of that awfulness has continued, and we still face it today. Less so where we first confronted it in what is known as a core, but it's returning and it's certainly prevalent elsewhere. So the coalition, I think, needs to be respected, regarded. I think it also needs to be protected and nourished if it is to do the job that we, I think, conclude still needs doing. So what does that job perhaps look like? Let's do this sort of geographically. Well, in Iraq, we often say that Daesh is down, but not out. Iraqi forces are on top of Daesh, but the coalition's assistance is still needed for that in practical terms. A little more time, in my view, is required before the Iraqi security forces and agencies can operate sufficiently independently to keep the lid on Daesh. I very, very much hope that governments of Iraq and the United States and other coalition countries and their forces, the legitimate authorities safeguarding Iraq and the Iraqi people's security and welfare, frankly, can be left alone by maligned actors so that they can stay resolute and together to work through the transition of the coalition's mission in an orderly and responsible way, as I think as I know, that President Biden and Prime Minister al-Sudani agreed in Washington last week. A messy return or messy retreat from the core by the coalition would allow Daesh to claim victory and resonate badly, I think, in the region and globally. I think it might also have a profoundly negative effect on the UN's presence in Iraq, and also, thinking more widely, Western political and economic confidence in Iraq. These things don't happen in isolation of each other, I'm afraid. Presence matters. Leave prematurely and you leave gaps, and others fill them. That's just a fact of political competitive life. I think we, including Iraq, in that respect, would lose in those circumstances. Now, many of the causes which brought about Daesh in Iraq remain. Violent extremism and sectarianism persists and needs squeezing out of Iraq's way of life. I'm not suggesting that Daesh will come back, as was, but I do fear a version of Daesh's brand of violent extremism lies dormant in Iraq, and we need to squeeze that out of the system, as I say. Syria. Well, Syria is a terrible and sad mess for all of the reasons that I think everybody will know full well. Yes, Daesh does not now hold territory as we would understand it. We can't draw large areas of black on the map as we once did, but it does hold sway, it does hold considerable influence, and in some areas that amounts to a form of occupation, I think a form of control. It enjoys an undercurrent of support that continues to be worrying for its ideology. And it is evidently capable on a regular basis, I'm afraid, of exploiting the country's chaotic security situation. We see that on a constant basis. And I think the consensus is growing that the sway that I'm talking about, the physical control, is growing slowly, but it is growing. Please do read, everybody, Charles Lister's recent piece in Al Mujalla for that, for an insight on that. It's not the first time that Charles, who knows his onions, has warned about Daesh's renewal in Syria. And he's not the only one pointing to it, but it's informed stuff. And we have the prisons and we have the camps. One of my colleagues in this organization, who does know what he is talking about, thinks the prisons and the camps represent the main strategic threat from the so-called core going forward. And I get that. I tend to agree with him. We have 9,000 Daesh fighters and radicalized men in those prisons who would be a terribly potent and immediately terribly potent fighting force if free. And longer term, if we consider the 26,467 children of a certain age in Al-Hol camp, if they're not removed or supported better than now, they will be radicalized. It's inevitable, I'm afraid. The degree to which, or the consequence of that, less clear. But their circumstances are pretty awful, and they're subject to Daesh propaganda and influence all the time. Daesh doesn't actually need to do much about them, I don't think. Just wait for bad things to happen. Elsewhere in the world, and I'll skate through this, as Shiraz Mahir wrote in the New Statesman recently, there's something depressingly familiar about the Daesh attack in Moscow. ISKP has been reborn to a certain extent. You see what happens when one party's strategic patience runs out and the other persists. Like persistence prevails. The Taliban may or may not be able to keep ISKP and AQ at bay in Afghanistan. Frankly, it looks as if they're not prepared to do that either. They're not willing to do that. We really can't allow Afghanistan to become a haven for terrorism again, or in more contemporary terms, a sort of antennae for terrorism elsewhere, propagated on the airwaves and online. It's pretty clear to us that ISKP is projecting its threat into regional states and Europe, including Russia, more effectively and more quickly than we feared. Threat levels are going up in Europe as attacks take place. Pro-Daesh platforms encourage more attacks, as we saw quite recently, and in particular on the big sporting events that are taking place in Europe over the summer. And those threats become headline news, and they absolutely did for 48 hours a few weeks ago. Job done. If I'm the propagandist with ISKP, I've just had a very successful project exercise. I've just got my name onto the front pages of all of the newspapers and the immediate feeds of all of the online news outlets in Europe. Terror, my terror, propagated. Success. And I'm afraid every month and yet another horrific attack in Africa takes place. I read that the continent is the epicenter of global terrorism, and it's usually, I'm afraid, directed towards West Africa and the Sahel. ISWAP holds territory in the Lake Chad Basin. It holds territory, it's running territory in a way that we didn't think possible after the liberations in Iraq and Syria. And it's become the main source of Daesh propaganda worldwide, outstripping the central media D1, which still exists, by the way, but also its other affiliates. JNM is slaughtering people in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. Coups and the Wagner Group have made matters much worse, as we knew they would, I'm afraid. Al-Shabaab remains frighteningly capable in Somalia, and Daesh is creeping its way across East, Central, and Southern Africa, Ethiopia, the DRC, Uganda, Mozambique. These are places of regular Daesh attack and assault. And I have not mentioned the radicalizing effects of the aftermath of the 7th of October, and I'm afraid we do have to be cognizant of that. I agree with the seasoned analysts who think that events in Gaza represent what is often referred to as a generational moment, where the consequences never quite leave us. They may subside with time, but they leave an indelible mark. My fear is that events in Gaza will blur the lines between terrorism, violent extremism, non-violent extremism, and actually responsible objection. And we see that in the UK to a certain extent. And I do mean events themselves and how they are accurately reported in the media, even without the distortion of extremist propaganda. I haven't mentioned AI. I won't come on to that too much. We think Daesh's capability with AI is quite low at the moment, but we know that they're already using AI to generate bomb-making instructions and novel imagery for its propaganda. And we know that Daesh are smart, then they learn. After all, it's Daesh that has harnessed the power of social media like no other terror organization over the last decade or so. So what might we do about all of this? One aim, which you and I, Omar, have discussed, is the extent to which we can, as an objective, not so much defeat Daesh, because I think that is quite a challenge, quite an ask, but to make Daesh and terrorism less relevant. The UK government's counterterrorism strategy speaks of a situation in which we can reduce the threat from terrorism so that people can go about their lives with confidence and freedom. It doesn't say we will eradicate it. It just means it becomes something that we can cope with, we can manage. And I think that's a decent objective to bear in mind. How might the coalition be part of that? Well, I think it has to be part of that. I think it has a pivotal role to play to achieve that, to counter the growing threat of terrorism that is growing once again, but also violent extremism that feeds that raw terrorism. How? Well, I've got some ideas, they're my own, so don't attribute too much to them, but for what they're worth, here are some thoughts. First, I think the coalition could start by being a little more confident and recognizing the successes that it has achieved. It's quite a quiet, subdued organization. I think it could shout a little more about how it's what it has done. It exists. It's an example of global mobilization that has worked in practice, not just in talking. It has saved, contributed to saving, and rebuilding the lives of thousands of people. So I think governments of the coalition and beyond the coalition could invest in the coalition a little bit more and what it has achieved and what it offers, therefore, for the future. Be a bit more confident about making the case for the ever smaller amount of resource and attention that is applied to counterterrorism work across the globe and also CVE work, given the other competing demands that we have on state coffers. So it could be resourced as well as be more confident, resource better, and be more confident about its future. Third thing I'd say, coalition is more than capable of capturing the many lessons that it has learned over the last decade. And not just the coalition, I think the wider CT and CVE community can help with that as well. The tasks it faces now are different, but they're not so different, I think, once you study them carefully. And above all, our understanding of that threat that Daesh and others offer up is much, much better than it was in 2014. We're much clearer about the enemy, the who, the what, and how of Daesh and other terror groups, and how to overcome them. Not completely, but we are much clearer about it. We're much more informed. Let's use that knowledge and with purpose. I think we're also much clearer about the drivers of terrorism, of how deprivation, human, social, economic, and political, generate conflict, abuse, extremism, violent extremism, and terrorism, and how all of these things come together. That's my third suggestion. My fourth is we're also much clearer about the value of integrating our response to these problems to adopt what is often described as a whole of government response, return. We're less good at translating it into action, but I think at least we're aware of the value of it in a way that we were not in 2014. These things were taken in isolation. We have a terror threat, we counter terror. We have a humanitarian crisis, we counter that. What we are not very good at is integrating those responses in a way that actually the adversary is good at integrating the consequences of its behavior. My fifth suggestion would be actually the cell might want to look at itself and how it's structured. We do the following, the cell, in the communication cell in London. We copy Daesh in many ways to compete with it and to beat it. We track Daesh's propaganda to see what it and its supporters are saying and chattering about, and how their propaganda is affecting audiences. We then work out how to compete with Daesh, the attention of those audiences with counter-narratives and alternative narratives. If you apply that principle across the broad sweep of the coalition, you might structure it on regional lines, like Daesh's wilayats, and not on the current thematic lines, where we have military interventions, communicative interventions, stabilization interventions, counter-finance interventions. Regional approach might just help to bring those thematic responses together a little bit more, the whole of government approach that I've mentioned. Bring it a bit closer to the needs in the particular places that we're talking about. Harness the expertise of those in those areas, including the governments in those areas concerned, and bring it all together to integrate what I call CV, CVE, conflict and development resources. You get more value for money out of that. My final suggestion would be that we've helped a number of countries along in the last 10 years. Iraq is the obvious example of that. They have learned a huge amount the hard way. They've now got learnings that the coalition as a whole can enjoy, can embrace to counter the Daesh threat that we face, not just in Iraq and Syria, but also in other places around the world. We need to capture that very hard fought but invaluable experience and learning. I think if you put all of that together, the effectiveness of the coalition's interventions and the value for money, and that's a very important factor, would increase hugely. It's a bit of a win-win-win for the coalition and beautifully a loss for Daesh. Act locally, project globally. That's what Daesh does well. And I think the coalition could take a leaf out of Daesh's book, rather ironically. And my final thought is, it is a rather intriguing and rather satisfying thought that maybe Daesh holds some of the answers to how the global coalition against Daesh might succeed in its second decade, as it has, I think, in its first. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, everybody. Let me stop there. very happy to take questions from what I hope was
Martin,
a worthwhile series of
Martin, thank
thoughts.
you. Thank you. You have already answered many of my questions that I've been preparing. But
sorry about that.
Yeah, but it's good that it helps me that I can come up with more fresh questions. But it's a question related. I mean, in a month or so, we are in the 10th anniversary of the fall of Mosul and the establishment of the coalition. And we have seen how important the global mobilization is. It's also important what you mentioned when we talk about the relevance. I mean, we clearly see that in the liberated areas, terrorism is no longer relevant. People are in the recovery phase. And that is very important to highlight. I also highlight the fact that you mentioned the coalition should be confident in speaking about its successes. But I will take you to another area, which is the challenges. I mean, uh, Afghanistan is a threat. ISIS in Afghanistan is a growing threat. As you say, that demonstrated in their Moscow attack that we are still relevant. The territorial control in Africa is also another message from ISIS saying we are still relevant. A forgotten area, which is the Philippines, makes ISIS still relevant. I mean, we are also talking about a mechanism of recruitment that ISIS is had used in Iraq, targeting vulnerable people. There are reports talking about targeting the poor Tajik people in other areas, etc., etc. I mean, what is the coalition's position in this? Like, is the coalition developing its policies? It's also a question came from the audience. Are you shifting the policy? What's being done about this?
Thank you, Omar. Thank you for those who asked this question. Yeah, the short answer is yes. Is it happening quickly enough? Probably not. Is the honest answer. So I think I mentioned. So let's take those theatres in turn. Afghanistan. As I mentioned, I think, and I'm not the only one to have mentioned this, very senior members of the US administration and the US military have been on the Hill to explain that the threat from ISKP is notable. And I think it is notably more notable quicker than we had imagined. I think what I can say is the coalition is conscious of that. And seeking to respond to that as quickly as is possible. And what I'm talking about there is there's a situation at the source. Now, working in Afghanistan is obviously an extremely difficult affair for rather obvious reasons. So you know, we have to be realistic about circumstances there. But the coalition is definitely working with some of the regional states more than before. Not all of them are members of the coalition, so there's always a matter there to ensure that those countries feel comfortable joining an organization or associating with an organization like the coalition. And that isn't a given. I'm afraid life doesn't work like that. But those relationships are definitely thicker than they were before. I think the other thing to bear in mind with ISKP is this point about projection. They're evidently, I think, more capable of throwing threat in distant places than has happened before, using technology, using propaganda. We're now in a very different age where terrorist attack requires large numbers of people with very organized terror plots. That still evidently takes place if states are not careful about the circumstances, the security in their countries. But it is evidently possible to project a threat from one location to another, many, many thousands of miles away. and have a terrorist consequence, a terror attack consequence. And I'm afraid ISKP are showing that they're capable of that. Africa, my goodness, Africa is complex. It is in many ways very poor in all sorts of ways. So the ability of Daesh and others to feed off those circumstances, I think, is actually much greater than it is in Syria and Iraq. Different types of poverty, but very similar to those that we saw in Iraq and Syria. It's a very big place. It's a very complex place. So the ability of an international organization to get its head around those circumstances, to build the capacity of indigenous forces, agencies, communities, much, much bigger than I'm afraid it was in Iraq and Syria, which by relative terms was really quite self-contained. And the reality is that we're not going to see a situation develop, I think, in which whole territories like Iraq and Syria were blackened by Daesh occupation. And a very deliberate kinetic response was deployed at the invitation of the Iraqi government and delivered by members of the coalition. I don't think we can envisage a situation where the coalition is going to be invited to do that, let alone be able to respond in that way, even if it were invited. So these are new, these are old, but also new circumstances, and the coalition is doing its best as much as it possibly can to respond to that in meaningful ways. I think there is evidently more to do. So the sooner it develops a nimbleness around those theaters, the better.
With the ideological differences between Al Qaeda, Hamas, and ISIS and Al Qaeda have made an attempt to once again make themselves relevant in the ongoing conflict. Al Qaeda has tried to say that we are still here. How realistic is the threat of Al Qaeda? Is there a concern that Al Qaeda might manipulate the current and ongoing conflict in the Middle East?
Oh, absolutely, and I think we're seeing it. There's always, whether it be ideological or however one wants to describe it, there's always competition between these groups. Daesh and Hamas, well, they don't really get on at all. But their ability to take advantage of their target audience's discomfort, or however you want to describe it, is considerable. Their ability to put certain frictions to one side, not necessarily to work operationally together, but to enjoy the discomfort and the radicalizing effect of that discomfort on populations is I think, very obvious. So we have traditionally tracked what Daesh is saying and doing about all sorts of circumstances. We're now doing the same with Hamas, Hezbollah, and so on and so on. And you won't be surprised to hear, people won't be surprised to hear that they're enjoying what is happening in the Middle East at the moment. And they're putting aside their differences. They're just focusing on, as I describe it, the discomfort of others to stoke the sort of underpinning grievance narrative that Muslim populations can have in these circumstances. And they're doing that very successfully, I'm afraid. The radicalizing influence of not so much their propaganda, but it makes matters worse. But as I said earlier on, the sort of daily events on the ground portrayed by actually entirely responsible media outlets, that's very evident, certainly in the UK, and I think in most European countries, and in the Middle East, and so on and so on. And as I hinted earlier on, that has risen sort of worry levels a lot in all sorts of capitals around the world. I suspect that the worry levels will come down as the initial consequences of what has happened are kind of lost, I'm afraid, in people's attention span. But it won't come down to where it was. And I think there are some really profound, potentially very profound consequences of, as I described it earlier, blurring lines, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, what is extreme, what is violent extreme, and justifiable in the circumstances that we are seeing. So the advantage is absolutely with the bad guys, I'm afraid. And then they're doing, in their own way, quite a successful job at gaining a return on that.
Martin, as the head of the Daesh counter Daesh communication cell, communication and counter narrative is fundamental, and it was fundamental in combating the rise of terrorism and the rise, especially the rise of Daesh. But what the question is, like, what have you learned, and is the coalition ready in the event that Daesh? Because I get this question often, like, is the new caliphate in Africa? Is the new caliphate in Afghanistan? What's being done about communication? Because in Africa, I have seen that Daesh has been using same videos were produced in Mosul, are streaming them again in African cities, but also the pamphlets. They are using the argument that, look, we were able to govern, we can do the same here. So what's being done about this?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, most people imagine that when stuff is taken offline, taken off the internet as a result of a particular incident, then it disappears. Well, I'm afraid it doesn't. You know, the archive, as it is rather sort of colloquially known, is there. It doesn't disappear. Daesh doesn't have to work very hard to repurpose that material and apply it against fresh target audiences. What have we learned? I think the big thing that we have learned in the cell in the 10 years that we have been operating is, yes, to address the immediate propaganda threat in all sorts of ways, in really quite traditional ways, but also to look at the longer term consequences of that propaganda and to look at it very scientifically. And that's what we try and do in the cell. What we don't do is say, this is what we think, and this is what we want others to think. And we're going to tell people that, and we're going to hope that they listen to it, and enough of it sticks if we tell them it enough. We're much more scientific about that. First of all, we work on the basis that we have an adversary, Daesh or Al-Shabaab or whoever, and they're smart. So we need to understand what the adversary is saying and doing, quite literally. And that's what we do, and its supporters. So in historic terms, you know, intelligence agencies, and they still do, talk of chatter as a way of gauging whether terrorist attacks are going to take place or not. It's a bit like a heat spot suddenly lights up in a location or a particular group of people, and warning bells go off as a consequence. Well, we now, 10 years on, with full use of social media and so on, supporters, members of Daesh, chatter in chambers that previously didn't exist, were previously reserved for their own intelligence operations. And that's what we access on a rolling basis, 24/7, to understand what that chatter with the small c is about, and where Daesh is projecting, and so on and so on. We then assess the consequences of that chatter on audiences in quite a scientific way with a lot of research. And I don't mean just academic research, I mean operational research as to how that terrorist propaganda is affecting people's attitudes and behaviors. And we then shape our campaigns accordingly so that we can compete with Daesh for those audiences' attention and ways of life. So I think the simple answer to your, and we will then run campaigns, and then we will evaluate them very scientifically and learn for the next series of campaigns. I think the simple answer, the straightforward answer to your question is, we've learned to take a longer term approach and a far more scientific approach in order to achieve what we call attitudinal behavioral change. Now, those who know about these things much more than I do will be able to say that that has all sorts of neurological implications. And that is the sort of space in which we try and operate. It may seem a long way distant from the raw terror of Daesh, but actually it's very much what we think Daesh is also about. So without suggesting in any way that we're learning from Daesh, in a way we are. If we could be as successful in countering Daesh's propaganda as Daesh has been in promulgating its propaganda, that would be quite an achievement and something that we seek to aim to achieve.
Indeed. I mean, also something very important. I mean, you said this earlier in your talk. What have also contributed to achieving, I think it also needs to be acknowledged by the coalition, is that the resilience of the people who were subject to the to the brutal rule of Daesh, and that in any future policy making they should be taken into account. But there is still an unsolved matter, and which is Al-Hol and ISIS prisoners. And this is probably, I mean, we are in the first decade. I mean, a decade later, and it's still, I know it has been discussed on different platforms, but the matter of Al-Hol is still a very pressing issue. I mean, is it better to be left to the national strategies, or should be taken in the hands of the coalition? I mean, what's the coalition's view on that matter?
Oh, it is that unless we eat into the size of Al-Hol and Raj prisons and these camps, unless we address the issues in those facilities, we're not countering the current, let alone the future threat fully. We simply can't ignore them, and I don't think the coalition are ignoring them. They're doing what they can. Let's be very clear, they're doing what they can in other people's territories. There are certain rules and regulations about how you need to behave in those circumstances, and the coalition is doing its very best to abide by those rules and those laws. I do want to come back to the question that I raised in my earlier intervention about success. I think about 18 months ago, it was commonly regarded as Al-Hol in particular as a total disaster. It's a terrible place. It still is a terrible place. But I think the work that has taken place over the last 18 months or so has given cause for some, I wouldn't say optimism, but I think some relief that there is circumstances in those camps are being addressed in a way that I didn't imagine that they would be. So they're becoming more of an opportunity than a challenge. Still a big challenge, but we're talking about a very different number of people in those camps now. And the more coalition, Iraq, local forces, local communities have really come together in a way that I think none of us could quite imagine, to reduce the size of that population, to rehabilitate large numbers of people, and to reintegrate them back into their communities. That's especially true in Iraq. And I do think the government of Iraq doesn't get enough credit for this. It's not a straightforward matter to reintegrate thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, in some cases from IDP camps, back into your societies. Resources are scarce in local communities. There are all sorts of issues to be dealt with there. These people have been in Al-Hol and Al-Raj and so on and so on for many years. Why wouldn't they be traumatized by that? How readily are they going to simply slip back into local communities? Why wouldn't local communities be very fearful of such people? So huge challenges there, but it's happening. It's not perfect. Of course it's not perfect. What is in Iraq and Syria? But it is happening. And I think the more governments and organizations get behind what I think is a developing success story, the sooner those numbers will come down, the sooner the threat will be reduced, the sooner the opportunity that Daesh will have to turn young children into fighters. That's a really absolutely a prize worth aiming for. So I'm keen on the idea of this becoming a success story, of people getting behind the success story, feeling that their contributions actually will make a positive difference. And I think that is happening, but absolutely more needs to be done.
Martin, I think there is a very important question mentioned in the chat, and that is, I think we have discussed this before. Um, in the African context, which is completely different from the Middle East context. There are groups who have aligned with ISIS, but they are more localized group. I mean, is there a way to find an approach to disconnect ISIS from these groups in order to find, find the vulnerabilities of ISIS? I think this is a very important matter to also explain the context of the difference of ISIS in a familiar territory than in an African territory.
It's a very good point, and the last point that you mentioned there, I think, is extremely relevant. My personal view of this is the more particular, the more specific, the more bespoke you can get, without going too far. The more particular you can get to a problem, the better. So you can, you're not going to address the opportunity and the threat that Daesh gains and poses across Africa by having a sort of pan-African approach to these things. You may have some guiding principles and so on and so on, but the sooner that you can get particular to the circumstances of a region, and then within a region, regions, and then within regions, communities. You can't do all of this. Nobody can do all of this. Nobody has the resource. Nobody has the capability to do all this. But if you can get very precise in applying all of your resources, a whole of government approach, the integrated approach, down to certain locations, you can turn it round. And if you can start rather you can create a more positive domino effect. So one of the lessons that I think we have learned is that if you can get local, actually in the way that Daesh does, if you can get really local and then project multiple local successes, you can do what Daesh does, which is you get local, you project global. I mean, we can use these terms however one wants to script them, but that's as a principle or as a way of operating, I think, is how Daesh has operated really successfully. They've identified particular locations where they want to operate. They've been very successful, and then they've told the rest of the world that they are successful. And if you do that in half a dozen places, suddenly you're kind of feeling that Daesh is everywhere, and they're not. A version of that can be achieved, I think, in reverse. It's a sort of rather peculiar counter-narrative to generate. But we're in the business of perception here. There needs to be a relationship between the realities, so we're not trying to fool people that we're solving problems. But if we've got success and we can amplify that success, you can create a very different perception of your ability to counter Daesh, in the same way as Daesh does the reverse.
I mean, back to the coalition's evaluation, Martin. Where is the coalition heading?
Well, I think it has a requirement to be around. As I mentioned earlier on, I'm afraid I don't think Daesh is defeated, either militarily or kinetically, or certainly not ideologically, for all of the reasons that I think everybody kind of understands. So in this year, I would say that the coalition needs to celebrate, not too loudly, but to celebrate and learn from what it has achieved in the last 10 years, and then project that learning onto not just the current threat that Daesh and others pose, but to look ahead a bit. You know, it would be wonderful to develop a situation in which the coalition, or whatever it might be called, is not chasing the problem all the time. There is something to be said for leaping ahead, anticipating a problem, not leaving behind the existing problem, but just identifying places where we know that if we don't do something proportionate, really probably quite small, now the problem gets bigger. And then we have to do something much bigger later on. And then we discover that we can't do that because we don't have the resources to do it, et cetera, or it's too late. So if we can, yes, be clear about where the major threats are, prioritize resources, but also kind of just reserve a certain amount of resource to leapfrog into the future, to anticipate the problem, to prevent violent extremism developing, not just countering it once it's there. I think that would be one of the things that the coalition might think very carefully about doing.
In a shift and a developed mechanism of counterterrorism, and I think we have discussed this, Martin, the role of the non-members of the coalition, the research organizations, the other actors, non-state actors, organizations. I mean, how do you project and see that role?
Oh, I think they have an invaluable role to play in this. You know, ultimately, this is what happens is to a certain extent, a large extent, going to come down to sovereign governments and how they interact in their territory, well, how they behave in their own territories, and how they interact as an international community to help each other. But getting governments to do good things and the right things and the smart things is not just a government affair. You know, good governments, good government organizations reach out and encourage debate around the subject matters that they are tackling, and listen to that debate and pick up the good ideas. So I think the wider community, academic community, think tank community, communications community in our circumstances, you name it, those with an interest in countering terrorism, countering violent extremism, conflict, not just counterterrorism. I just want to emphasize this point. The counterterrorism world can get a little siloed. It gets very preoccupied with the next threat coming down, coming at it. But this is a wider problem. This is a societal problem. And without making it too big, so it becomes unmanageable, the more people can contribute to the debate around how we blunt, make terrorism irrelevant, Daesh irrelevant, and so on and so on, the better, including those who know about conflict, stabilization and development, good governance, and so on and so on, because I think these are all absolutely fundamental to ultimately how we wring. I often describe we're in the business of wringing out Daesh, squeezing out Daesh from people's ways of life. And that I think requires a whole of society, a whole of government effort. But I'm stressing, in answer to your question, a whole of community response, I think. So the more debate, the more articles I can see in the press, in the academic press about the coalition, reflecting upon it, and where it might go, what lessons it might learn, the better. That's a positive, healthy circumstance that I'd hope this discussion might help to generate.
Yeah, in light of talking about the importance of collaboration, I think I would like to announce that the program on extremism in collaboration with the coalition is releasing soon, a special episode where we interviewed people from DRC, from Australia, from London, from Iraq, who were all survivors of terrorism, but they showed the resilience, which in a way shows the importance of the work of the coalition and other actors. Martin, we have 1 minute left, and but I want to apologize to our audience for not answering all the questions. I reserve this 1 minute to Martin.
Oh, well, I apologize to every listener, not in seeking to answer some of the questions I've managed to not answer any of them. I do apologize for that. I hope it's been useful. I hope my final thought is the one that I've just mentioned, that we're in this 10th anniversary. Let's use it. We don't have this opportunity very often. So let's use it. Let's have a good, healthy debate about what has happened over the last 10 years. What I think we all know is going to have to happen over the next 10 years, and how we can achieve as much success following 10 years as we have in the last 10 years. So the good, healthy debate about that, I think, is more likely to generate greater success than otherwise. So please do engage, everybody.
Martin, thank you very much for your insights. I would like to point our listeners to follow the Program on Extremism website. We do have more events coming. Once again, Martin, I appreciate your time.
Not at all. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.